Hello and welcome to the University of Maryland's Zooming into Healthy Horsekeeping Spring 2020 webinar series. We're so excited for those of you that are joining us and those of you that may be listening later to this recording. I am Jennifer Reynolds. I am the Extension Coordinator for Equine and Poultry Programs at the University of Maryland. I'll be assisting as host with some of our background work today. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Maegan Perdue, who will be giving today's presentation. Maegan is the agriculture educator for Worcester County Extension Programs here in Maryland. She has a bachelor degree in agriculture. She focused on animal science with that and has done quite a bit of work with nutrient management advising here in Maryland as well. So she's pretty well-rounded in a lot of the things that we need to know and deal with here in Maryland agriculture, especially with animal programs. As a youth, she spent most of her summers riding ponies around the farm and works with some multi-species grazing and integrated parasite management practices on her own animals as well. So we're very excited to have her here, and she will be presenting Parasite Resistance. It's a numbers game.
Thank you, Jen. Yes, I work with a lot with parasite resistance. I have small ruminants, but I've always had horses my entire life, and kind of got forced into the parasite world while I was in college because I was helping a lot with my advisor who worked with small ruminants and parasite resistance. And I found it fascinating back then that in the small ruminant world, they were doing stuff that wasn't being done in the equine world. Back then it was deworming on a schedule with horses, and we had moved past that, but now it seems like everything is catching up. We do a lot of our research on small ruminants and then transfer that to the larger species. So the small ruminants are kind of the guinea pigs of the parasite world. And I have a love-hate relationship with parasites. I love to study them. I don't like dealing with them in my own animals because they do have an adverse effect on production, and so our working animals, our growing animals, have a hard time when we have a lot of parasite disease. So at first, I will give you a little bit of a background on dewormers, anthelmintics. So the first dewormers were developed in the 1940s, so they've been around for a long time. It's interesting, before that, we were doing more natural things to control parasites, and then they started coming out with chemical dewormers, and now we're kind of moving back to some more natural control methods. One that might be familiar to you if you've worked with poultry is piperazine. That was developed in the 1950s, and then some that are more common for anybody that works with grazing species, whether it's horses, cattle, or small ruminants, the benzimidazoles, the white dewormers, so our panicures, safeguards, those were all developed in the 1960s. And then came mid-1970s pyrantel. That's you're probably familiar with that one as well as a horse dewormer. And then the 1980s brought us the ivermectins and moxidectins. So ivermectin and Quest type products came out in the 1980s. So it's been a long time since we've had a new dewormer. I mean, you go to any feed store, you're gonna find at least 3 of these on the shelf as an available dewormer to you, but these have been around a long time, and that's not necessarily a good thing when we're dealing with parasites. So in the 1960s, the parasitologists recommended deworming every 2 months, and that stuck around for a really long time. We were doing regular deworming for a really long time up until fairly recently. And why they recommended every 2 months is because they noticed that the eggs were returning 2 months after the initial treatment. And their goal back then was to eliminate parasites. That is not our goal today, but their goal back then was they thought they were going to eliminate the parasites. Back then, the main parasite was the Strongylis vulgaris. And they've seen that that program was pretty successful on that particular parasite. So when we're looking at the life cycle of a parasite, you've got to start with a horse. When we're dealing with equines, we start with a horse that actually has parasites. So the eggs are passed in the feces. So down towards the right, you're going to see the little pellets, little worm eggs in there. Those are passed in the feces, and the fecal ball acts as a nice little cocoon for the eggs of the parasite, which allows it to survive better. These will develop into larvae And then finally it's gonna develop into they'll go through L1, L2, and L3 stages. That L3 stage is the infective stage for most internal parasites that we deal with in grazing species. And then a horse, any type of grazing animal, is gonna become infected with them as that larva migrates up a blade of grass. And then they ingest it, the worms continue to develop. They may, depending on what type they are, they may migrate through the tissues. Then they start, as they become adults, they start reproducing and pass the eggs back into the feces again, and that whole cycle starts again. Some things to keep in mind is the eggs from these internal parasites will start hatching around 43 degrees Fahrenheit, and the larva can develop up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So anywhere in that 40 to 100 degree Fahrenheit range of temperature, we're gonna have some parasites on our pastures that are developing. And for those of us in the mid-Atlantic region, that's most of the year. So most of the year, the parasites can survive outside of the animal. In optimal conditions, it only takes 3 to 4 days for that larva to reach that L3 or that infective stage. The L3 stage, the infective larval stage, important thing to note about that is it doesn't feed. So there are some things that we can do to make that L3 larva use up its energy reserves before it can get into a host. This circled area, those are all the areas that we have some control over outside of the horse. Once it's in the horse, we're reliant on chemical dewormers, but there are things that we can do, management practices that we can put in place that will help mitigate the effects of these parasites and help animals not to become reinfected with them. So what is parasite resistance? I mean, it's an important concept when we're dealing with grazing animals to know what parasite resistance is so that we use our tools in the correct way. So we are using chemical dewormers correctly and not abusing them and causing the problem to get worse. Well, the parasite resistant refers to a parasite's ability to survive deworming. And what ultimately happens with this, if you don't manage it properly, you're gonna have ineffective dewormers. The first cases of parasite resistance were first documented in the 1960s. So our first dewormers were not around very long before we had parasite resistance to them. And you figure our most commonly used ones, the ivermectins, the moxidectins, they've been around since the 80s. So we have widespread resistance to all drug classes that we currently have on the market. So how this resistance occurs is our dewormers are not 100% effective. Even our best management practices with using them correctly, best case scenario, they're still not gonna be 100% effective. And when we do stuff like not using the proper dose because we don't know a good estimate of the animal's weight. And I know this is sometimes hard with the horse because you're not gonna just pop them on your bathroom scale, but you may need to use a weight tape. And I know when I've had my vet out to look at my horses, she threw a weight tape around them. Usually she told me they were too fat, but she did put a weight tape on them. And those are good estimators of what the weight is of that animal. When we don't store these medications properly, they're all gonna have a target. You know, you might leave it in your car and it's 100 degrees outside, or you let it freeze. We need to store them properly according to the directions, and we need to use ones that are not expired. When we have resistant parasites that survive the treatment, they're gonna pass those genetics on to the next generation. And a lot of these parasites can make thousands of eggs. So it doesn't take one parasite. I mean, it's way worse than your barn cats at home, you know, giving you 20 offspring in a short amount of time. These parasites are capable of passing on thousands of eggs a day. So they can, just a few surviving can have bad implications on your program at home. They will propagate themselves, and then once these worms survive this deworming treatment, well, all of those, if you don't have other susceptible worms in that population, then everything that you have is going to be resistant to that anthelmintic or that dewormer. All right, so why is this a problem? Well, the major problem is there's no new anthelmintics available for horses, and this goes the same for other grazing species as well. The last new class of anthelmintics was introduced in the 1980s. It takes a very long time for those to get approved for use in the US. There are some that are on the market in New Zealand and the Australia area, but they haven't come over to the US yet, and this takes a long time. And if they do, they may come over as Or if we do have something developed, it might be used and approved for another species, but not for our grazing animals at that time. And then there's also pasture problems. So most of your eggs from parasites are going to be spread 80%. The rule is an 80-20 rule for contaminators. So 80% of the eggs are generally shed by 20% of the animals. So you may have one horse that contributes most of the eggs on your farm. And the good thing is that we can identify those animals. If we're running fecals, we can identify who our big shedders are. Most internal parasites thrive in warm and moist environments. So the mid-Atlantic and the southeast are the perfect environment for this. They're warm, they don't get too cold, but they also stay moist. We have high humidity levels. So even if it is super hot outside, we're not dried out. So these parasites can still survive. Now, if you go out west where it gets really hot, but it's also very dry, they don't have as much of a problem with it. But our area is like the ideal area for internal parasites. The optimal temperature for larval development is 77 to 91 degrees Fahrenheit. So you figure that's a lot of our spring and summertime right there. So we have a huge chunk of our year that is the optimal temperature for larval development. Again, it doesn't get hot enough or cold enough or dry enough to kill off the larvae from these internal parasites. And also rain and dung beetles can help spread the larvae. So we get a lot of rain in this region. So that's going to help spread larvae. And then the larva, the infective stage of the larva, the L3 stage, can travel up to 4 inches up a blade of grass. But it does require a bit of moisture. Well, most mornings you go out, there's been some dew, so there's always a little bit of moisture, or there's some humidity in the air. There's always some moisture at some point during the day that's going to allow that larva to travel up a blade of grass. We'll talk a little bit about chemical control, which is our dewormers, our anthelmintics that we use to control them. So this American Association of Equine Practitioners, their statement in regards to parasite control is to limit parasite infections so that animals remain healthy and clinical illness does not develop. The goal is not to eradicate all parasites from a particular individual. So what they're saying is their goal is to minimize the risk of disease. There's always going to be some parasites in there, but we don't want them to have a parasite disease. We don't want it to be adversely affecting their health. We don't want diarrhea. We don't want production losses from them. We want to control egg shedding. So we're going to keep an eye on our big shedders, and then we want to slow the development of resistance. We don't want to deworm to the point that our anthelmintics are no longer working. So what can you do? We need to slow down the development of resistance. So when we use an integrated approach to parasite management, we're going to help do that. So you want to be working with your veterinarian. You want to be using strategic deworming. You don't want to go to the feed store and buy 6 tubes of dewormer and deworm every horse in your pasture. You want to deworm only the ones that need it. You can control what you can control. So we can control how we manage our pastures. We can control how clean we keep our pastures. And there's also this concept of refugia. In this concept, we're not going to be treating all the animals at the same time. So we're going to be leaving by leaving an animal untreated, we are leaving susceptible parasites in the environment. So they're going to pass on their genetics as well. When we deworm the animal, those resistant parasites are passing on their genetics, but we also have an animal that hasn't been dewormed. So those parasites are also passing on their genetics and going to be in that same environment. And we also don't want to move treated animals to clean pastures. The same thing happens there. If we take an animal, we treat it and we move it to a clean pasture, well, all the eggs that it is shedding are coming from parasites that are resistant to that dewormer we just used. So if that pasture is clean, the only thing being deposited on it is resistant parasite genetics. So that's the reason that we don't move animals that have been treated to clean pastures. And this is more of a fairly new concept. When I first started working with this several years ago, we were treating them and then we were moving them to a clean pasture. That's good for the animal while it's recovering if it has a parasite disease, but that's not good for the pasture. All that is contributing to parasite resistance. So they have found that that is not a good practice to do. So now we are leaving them on that pasture. We're not immediately moving them to a clean pasture. All right, so when do we deworm? Well, in horses, you want to perform a fecal egg count. They don't respond to parasites the same way that small ruminants. Small ruminants become very anemic when they have a high parasite load or a parasite disease. But we rely more on fecal egg counts in equine. So this can be done through your veterinarian. It's a great way to develop a good relationship with your veterinarian if you're not accustomed to using one all that often. You can collect them and send them to a private lab. There are a lot of labs around the country right now that will allow you to collect fecals and send them to you, and they will send a report back. That report then is going to need to be shared with your veterinarian so you can discuss who needs to be dewormed and why and when and what the right type of dewormer is going to be. You could learn to do this yourself. I mean, I personally don't like doing fecals. It's a very tedious job, and it is well worth it to spend a couple dollars and have somebody else do it for me. You can also perform fecal egg count reduction tests. This type of test is designed to tell you whether or not whatever it is that you are using to deworm is actually effective. So what you would do is you would do a fecal egg count on the animal, you would deworm, and then you'd come back 14 days later and do another fecal egg count and see how much the egg counts have been reduced. And ideally you should get a significant reduction if that dewormer is working. You want to pay close attention to your vulnerable population, and I think we're all familiar with that term right now. But in horses, that's going to be your foals, your young animals that are developing an immune system. Your seniors, we raise our horses, we feed them well now, and they live long lives. Well, as they get older, they're going to be more vulnerable to disease. And then our working animals, their bodies are stressed more than the pasture pet or the hay burner that's out in the field next door. So if you have working animals that are, maybe they are brood mares or they're race horses, we need to pay closer attention to those because they're going to be more vulnerable. You want to work with your veterinarian. Your veterinarian is going to help you determine if or when you should deworm. I mean, in many cases, if your animal's not a hardworking animal, they might not need to be dewormed all that often, unless they're a high egg shedder and you're trying to cut down on your contamination of your pastures. And we want to make sure we're doing it at the right time, given the right dose, and using the right product. And that's where your fecal egg counts can help you determine whether you're using the right product. Get an estimate of the weight, make sure you're using the right dose, and consult with your veterinarian on what the right time is. So there are some things that we can do in the environment that can also help control parasites. One is going to be cleanliness, and quarantine can help with that. When you get a new animal, you are getting its parasites too. So if you're buying an animal that is off of a farm and they've had really poor parasite management, maybe they've dewormed with ivermectin every month for the past 20 years, you're probably going to be getting parasites that are resistant to ivermectin. So we want to isolate those animals until we know what we are dealing with, until we can get that under control. You don't want to isolate them on pastures that your other horses are going to be utilizing. So you don't want to put a new horse on a pasture that in 30 days you're going to be throwing your horses onto, because those eggs are still going to be there. In many cases, it would be good to put these on in a dry lot, just in maybe a sand ring, someplace where your other animals aren't going to be grazing. You can consult with your equine veterinarian about what products to use during this time. Get the fecal egg counts done. You can perform a fecal egg count reduction. This would be a good time to do a fecal egg count reduction test to find out what type of parasites, what type of resistance is coming in with that animal. And you want to keep them separated long enough for the eggs to pass through. We can eliminate some of our chances of the animal picking up parasites in a couple of different ways. We can implement zero grazing, and this is sometimes a bad word when we talk about grazing animals, because if you have pasture, you want your animals on pasture, especially when it's out there growing this time of year when it's starting to get thick. It saves us some money on hay, but this is not a bad thing to implement zero grazing if you're dealing with parasites. In this situation, you might keep the animals in a stall and turn them out into paddocks where there's no grass. So if there's anything green growing, a grazing animal is probably going to go after it, whether they're hungry or not. So I tell everybody, no grass. You don't want any grass in there, because I've seen some people, what they call their dry lot is actually like a ½ inch of grass. Well, most animals are going to go nibble at that, because usually that's the nice tender stuff. We don't want there to be any grass in this situation. The nice thing about horses compared to other livestock species is sometimes they're a little bit more tidy with their bathroom habits. You might fuss at that mare that goes and poops in the corner of her stall or poops in her bucket in her stall all the time. Maybe she's just helping you clean the pasture and keep the pasture cleaner. But there are some horses that like to poop in a pile, this makes it easy to remove that. And if you remove those piles before the eggs hatch, you're going to keep your pastures cleaner. And when we compost the manure, if we get that temperature up high enough, in an ideal situation where it's hot enough to be considered compost, we're going above that 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which is going to destroy the eggs and the larvae. So then that compost would then be safe to reapply at a later date. And then just general cleanliness, ensure that your feed and water is not contaminated with manure piles. Don't feed on the ground, keeping troughs clean, and then utilizing hay feeders to keep that hay up off the ground so they're less likely to go and eat in areas where the infective larvae are. Keeping healthy pastures is an excellent way to mitigate parasites in a grazing system. So we want to keep the grass taller than 3 inches, because remember that the infective larvae travel generally 2 to 3 inches, but can up to 4 inches up a blade of grass. So we want to keep them taller than 3 inches. This is healthier for the grass. It makes for a healthier pasture, but then there's less chance of that animal ingesting infective larvae. We also want to use proper stocking rates. So this is going to help keep the pasture at the appropriate height. If we're not being overgrazed, we don't have too many animals in there. And there's less chances of the animal being forced to graze around a manure pile where it's going to have the biggest chance of ingesting that infective larva. When you have if you have too many animals on a pasture, your more susceptible animals sometimes get pushed aside. They don't get the best grazing spots. The bullies might push them around and they have to graze around those manure piles that they would normally avoid if there was enough pasture. A good rule of thumb, depending on where you are and how productive your pastures are, is generally 1 horse per 1 to 2 acres. I know a lot of us at one point, I think we had way too many on our farm when I was growing up. We also ended up feeding a lot of hay though too. You can renovate your pastures. This is going to give you better forage selection, which is going to lead to less overgrazing of the desirable forages. So, if you have an unimproved pasture, you might have some really nice grass, and you might have some areas where it's just weeds. All the animals are going to go for that nice grass. But if you renovate your pasture, you get it in good shape, they're all going to have a good spot to graze. And then another benefit to this is if you till it. So if you do a complete renovation and you go through and you till that land before you reseed it, not just overseeding it, if you bury the larvae, a lot of times they will use up their energy reserves trying to get back to the top, and they'll die because they've used up all their energy reserves. So that's an added benefit to renovating your pastures. We also want to implement pasture rotation. So this is going to allow those pastures to rest. They can grow, get back to the height that we need them. The picture, it's a really nice picture on this slide, but it is a horrible, I think it's probably like a place like Assateague where there's just wild ponies running around, but there's no grass there. Those animals, if that was a pasture, they should be pulled off of that immediately. There's no grass there. The animals are basically grazing next to dirt. That is what we do not want when it comes to parasite control. And then when you allow those pastures to rest, you're also disrupting the parasite life cycle. The pastures are not going to be considered clean because we need to rest them for a really long time in order for those parasites to die. Some of them can survive up to a year if the environment is right, like we have around here. So we can't consider those, quote, clean, but it's gonna help control some of the parasites. And then the horses, for this situation, the horses must be moved before the grass gets too short. So you don't want to let them graze down to the dirt. You want to let them graze down to 3 inches, and you want to move them. It encourages, if you move them more frequently, it's going to encourage more uniform grazing. So they're not going to be as picky about overgrazing some areas and then not touching other areas until they have to. We can also implement multi-species grazing. This can help with parasite control. And what we do with this is we graze 2 different species, but these 2 species can't share the same parasites. So multi-species grazing is not horses and donkeys. Multi-species grazing is not sheep and goats. They share parasites. This is generally when we're talking about a horse situation, we want to rotate the horses with a ruminant animal. So either a cow or a sheep or a goat can help with this. The one advantage to this is these 2 different species can have have complementary grazing habits. So if you are using goats, the goats might eat weeds that your horses won't touch. Sheep will eat pretty much anything. I mean, they'll go out there and they'll graze buttercups. But you want two that aren't sharing those parasites, because if a goat goes and eats a horse larva from a horse parasite, it's a dead end for it, and vice versa. If the horse eats like the barber pole worm in the goats, which is the main parasite of sheep and goats, it's a dead end for them because it's not the appropriate species. So you want to make sure that they're not you choose two species that don't share parasites. There are a few parasites that are shared by all, and that is something you would need to speak to either an extension specialist in your area or your veterinarian to find out if this is something that you should worry about. It's just two in particular. One is one's a liver fluke, and I think the other one's the bankrupt worm that can affect sheep and goats, and I think cattle as well. So that's something, if that's something that is a concern in your area, this might not be a good option for you. Keep in mind when you do this, it's going to reduce your stocking density. So if you throw a cow out there with your horses, that's going to take up the place of 1 to 2 horses. So you may have to move your animals more frequently, or you might not have enough pasture for them. If you get 5 or 6 sheep out there to help with parasite control, that's going to take up the space of a horse. So if you don't have a lot of pasture, this might not be a good thing for your operation. I will say use caution. I see a lot of times when people want to use a goat as a companion animal, because most people who like horses also like to have a goat around. The thing I caution, and I've told my vet this when she's asked me my opinions on a person getting a goat, we have to make sure that they play nice. You know, it's fun to see a horse out there with a goat jumping on it and it tolerating it. But horses sometimes a horse thinks that it's a cutter and it's going to go in there and rodeo the goats, herd them up, move them to another pasture for you. I've seen them do it with larger animals as well. I've seen donkeys grab a goat by the back of the neck like they would a fox if they were protecting them. Sometimes our larger animals just get fed up with the annoying smaller animals and will attack them. One kick from a horse could put down a goat or smaller animal. So we have to make sure they can play nice. Also in the summertime when we have fireworks going off, if a horse gets spooked, it might start chasing other animals in the pasture. If that animal is small, it can chase them until it kills them. And I have seen situations like that, especially in the summertime when there's fireworks being shot off at a close proximity. So we have to keep those things in mind. Another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about multi-species is feeding. I've never seen a goat or a sheep not go after horse feed if it's available. And sometimes that's not good for the horse. Sometimes that's not a goat eating horse food is not good for the goat. There's some medications in livestock feeds that we don't want our horses to get into because it can be toxic. So feeding may become a challenge when we have multi-species. And also there's smaller animals like a goat with horns. There's always the risk that it could hurt the horse. So again, we got to make sure that they're going to play nice. This works out well for some people. Some people it's a nightmare. My sheep and goats can get away, can get under the fence because I have a fence within a fence that the pony won't go through the electric wire, but it's high enough that the sheep and goats can get out of it. So if she starts to chase them, they do have an escape, and they're never fed together either. So always keep that in mind. Discuss it with someone, make sure that it is going to work for you if you decide to add another species into your horse pasture. Another option is just to rotate the species. So in this situation, we're going to start with our most susceptible group on that quote clean pasture. So the pasture that has been rested the longest that we're moving the animals to, we're going to start with the most susceptible group. So if you have production horses, that might be the horse. If you are raising goats and you have pasture pet horses, then your goats are probably going to be your most susceptible group. So it depends on the work level of your animals, what you are using them for, or sometimes who's the most valuable one. That's the one you're going to put on the pasture first, on that clean pasture first. One thing that we do when we're dealing with horse pastures is sometimes we will drag them. When we do that, the animals should be removed, and we need to figure on those pastures being rested for the rest of the season. So this is not something we want to do in the spring when we're going to turn the animals back out on there in a month. This needs to be something we do more towards the fall, or if you're done with that pasture for the year, then you can go ahead and drag it. One benefit of this is it's going to distribute the nutrients from that manure It might help you have a more productive pasture. Might get some consistency there, get those nutrients spread out. There's lots of good nutrients in manure. We'll get some of the benefit of the potash, the organic matter. Instead of just being in one spot, we're gonna distribute that throughout the pasture. One problem with this is it can make parasite problems worse. So when we do that, we are breaking up those little fecal balls. We're spreading out the eggs and the larvae over the pasture as well. If we have a hot, dry day, that might help kill the eggs and the larvae. If not, if it's warm, cloudy, moist, they may be able to survive. So if these conditions are favorable, they're gonna survive that, and then we've made them spread out over a larger area instead of just having those in those manure piles. So there are some new alternatives available. One of those is Livamol with Biowerma. This is new for the US. I think it came out the beginning of last year. It just became available in the US. What this is it's a fungus that you put in the feed for the animal. Any type of grazing animal you can use this on. And that fungus survives the digestive tract. It comes out in the fecal balls. And what it does is it traps and kills the nematode larva. Again, this is a new product in the US. It was started, I think, over in New Zealand. We only have, because it's a new product, we have limited retailers. And I think there are some sub-retailers now as well, but Premier One Supplies was the initial retailer for this product. And it's something that you have to feed every day when the temperatures are 40 degrees and up. So for us, that's most of the year that we would need to feed this product. So the one big drawback to that is it's expensive. You use the animal's weight. It's dosed by animal weight. So it costs around $4 per 1,000 pounds of animal per day. So you're looking at an added expense of $4 for every horse every day. So you're talking about almost, that's a huge expense at the end of the month. And I don't think a lot of us are willing to put that out, can afford that for our horses. So that is a huge drawback to this product. Will it get cheaper as time goes on? Hopefully. But it still might not be worth it for you unless you have a valuable animal and a huge parasite problem. What it can do is, according to the research they've done so far, it can reduce parasite larvae on pasture by an average of 84% in horses. So if you have a really contaminated pasture, this can help you out. But then again, if it's that contaminated, it might be cheaper for you to pull your animals off of the pasture, put them in a dry lot situation, and feed them hay, because hay is going to be, I mean, you're probably going to end up spending less on hay than you would on the product. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you are considering something like this. Take into account how often you have to use it and what the cost of it is. So conclusions is, when we use an integrated parasite management plan, part of that is working with your equine vet. You want to identify the parasites that you are dealing with, so you use the right product, and we want to see what our fecal egg count is. They're always going to have parasites, but we don't want to deworm them just because they have parasites. We want to deworm them because they need it. So if their fecal egg count is super high and we want to reduce that potential for pasture contamination, or if we're seeing a problem with production, it could adversely affect their health, then we need to deworm them. But this is something that should be worked out with your equine veterinarian so that you have a good protocol in place before you use the dewormers. We also want to make sure that we're not using ineffective dewormers. I know ivermectin is fairly cheap, but if it's not doing anything for your animals, then you're wasting your money with it. So we want to make sure that what we're using is working. We want to keep it clean. So when you can, clean up the manure, rest your pastures anytime you can. And we want to keep those pastures healthy. I mean, we know raising grazing animals that we want a healthy pasture. More grass means less hay that we're buying. But it also is good for mitigating these parasite problems. So rotate if possible. Keep that pasture height at 3 inches or more. And then if you have other species available, if you have a diverse farm with some small ruminants or a cow on them, rotate with them, utilize them. I know in opposite scenarios, people who raise ruminants that happen to have a horse, well, they put that horse to work in their system so that they're rotating their pastures with the horse to help with parasite problems. None of these by themselves are gonna work just by themselves. We need to use them all together in order to control parasites. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Jen, see if we have any questions.
We did have a couple of things that were brought up in the chat. One was about not deworming if a negative fecal test is present or a low fecal test is present. Do you want to mention anything about that?
Most likely, if you're coming up with a negative fecal test, congratulations. Great job. We don't want to deworm if we don't. There's no point in it. And the more we expose parasites to dewormers, the more likely we are to have resistant parasites. So if you're coming up negative, it'd be great if you truly are negative. There's probably some there, but that's a situation. If your fecal is negative and you don't believe it, get another fecal. Because I have been in those situations where you're like, this doesn't make sense. There's no way that animal is negative. So don't be afraid to ask, you know, is this possible? Was it handled? Was the feces handled properly? So and that's something I would ask the vet, you know, if it's being sent through the vet, most likely it is being handled properly, and your vet should be telling you whether or not you should be deworming that animal. But in most cases, you're not going to deworm an animal that comes up negative for a fecal. If you see some health problems that you would normally associate with worms, but the fecal is negative, then that's another conversation for your vet to investigate why that animal is having those symptoms. Like if it's having diarrhea and you thought it was parasite problem, but the fecal came back negative, well, then we need to look someplace else for what the problem was. But there's no need to, if it's a negative fecal, there's no need to deworm it.
We have another question that is about the length of time to put a horse onto pasture after deworming. You had mentioned about not putting them directly out onto pasture, a new pasture, after being dewormed. So how long should they wait?
That's a tricky one depending on what type of parasite that you're dealing with and what you expect that, I think it's called the egg reappearance period to be. Generally speaking, you're going to want to wait a couple of weeks. But if you have other animals that you haven't dewormed, then you should be able to generally after 14 days is when you should be seeing new parasites or new eggs. And that's why we wait 14 days after that to do the fecal egg count reduction test. So I'd say after a couple of weeks, you should be good to move it on there, but also it helps if you're moving animals that haven't been exposed to the dewormer as well. But that one is, again, that one's going to depend on probably what parasite you are dealing with. And some of these parasites, they can insist too. They're very good at surviving non-optimal conditions. So a lot of these parasites will go into like an arrested development when the weather's too cold. They just stop. They just stop reproducing. And some dewormers will work against the encysted larva, some will not. And that's another reason why we need to be working with our vets to make sure that if we're in a situation where, and that could be a reason for a negative fecal, if they're encysted, and that's when we're not going to deworm them. We're going to deworm them when they're active, when these parasites are active. So again, another reason why you should be working with a vet and not just deworming them on schedules or what you think might be going on.
And I think our next question probably relates to that need to be working with your vet throughout this process as well, about using, if the incorrect parasite dewormer, using one that was not appropriate could result in colic or other side effects, I guess, for a horse, and how that would be avoided.
Yeah, I just did read actually about parasites and using an anthelmintic and resulting in colic, and it looks like there's conflicting information on that, and each animal is going to be different. So could it happen to somebody and not happen to somebody else, do the identical thing with a different animal and not happen to them? Probably so. So yeah, that is something I would ask the vet. But if you're working with the vet from the start, hopefully you're going to be using the right anthelmintics on the animal. And I know there's a lot of controversy on ages for certain anthelmintics too, based on stories that people hear on Facebook. But there's another reason to work with the vet so you know what the risk is, because there's always going to be some risk. There's some risk if you don't use the correct dose. I mean, if you overdose something, there can be bad side effects. That's why we need to be making sure we have the right weight. And if you're dosing smaller animals, you might want to measure out the dewormer in a separate syringe so you don't accidentally give the whole syringe. But yeah, that's something that I would consult with the vet about. There's so many things that could cause it. So, you know, not necessarily, it could be coincidence too.
We have a follow-up question about when you had talked about the parasites potentially being encysted, or there are times when you cannot tell if they're active and you want to deworm when they're active. The question is, how do you know when they are active? Is that with the fecal egg test?
They're going to be active. Well, if you get a positive fecal, if you get a lot of eggs in your fecal egg test, then they're going to be active. But also the time of the year is going to play a lot into that. Your temperature is going to play a lot into that. So in the middle of the winter, if it's a really cold winter, you might not find them active. But generally this time of year in the spring up until fall, for most areas, then the temperatures, the conditions are going to be correct that they should be active. So that's where the right time needs to come into play, because you want to make sure, because they want to give the dewormer when they are active. Because if you're given the wrong dewormer and they're encysted, then it's just not going to work.
Okay, we have one other question that is again referring to some side effects of the dewormer, asking about any literature regarding the development of hives in horses after using an anthelmintic.
That is another one. Let me see. There's a really good book. It's a little expensive, but if you do have if you have a lot invested in your horses and you've been having problems with them, it would probably be a good read for you. It's called The Handbook of Equine Parasite Control. There's always if you have access to like literature databases, so if, you know, like us, as we work for the College of Agriculture for University of Maryland, we have access to our library, which has, you know, we can do literature searches, we can get full text articles, and these are scientific articles. You will see some, and I'm just looking because I think I did come across hives too. Again, that's probably something just that horse maybe having a problem with it. But I do know that I did find, I did see something about that. If you want to email me, so I have your email address. If I find that, I will send that to you. If I can find where it talks about adverse reactions to anthelmintics, I will send that directly to you if you send me an email. And just I've been getting a lot of emails lately, so about some of these webinars, so just tell me that it's about hives and horses, and if I can locate that, I will send that to you. I'll put my address in here.
And we can certainly post the links that are referenced to some of these things. When we post this video to our YouTube channel, I'll make sure that some of these links are included at the description so that you can find those. And if you're watching this as a recording, that's where those links will be found. What would be considered, Megan, a high egg count?
That's going to depend probably on the species that you're looking at and the veterinarian that you're dealing with. I don't know specifically what is considered high. It would just depend on the parasite that you're dealing with. A lot of times we're going to do fecal egg counts on everybody in there. We're going to find our high egg shedders, but high egg shedders for one is not going to be necessarily a high egg shedder for another. So again, yeah, I would ask your veterinarian. Usually they are going to tell you who you need to deworm and who you don't. Generally, you're not going to come up with zeros, but they're going to have a certain level of parasites. They're going to have a certain amount of parasites in their system. They're not going to be totally free from them.
I think that addresses most of the questions. If anyone else has something that they would like to specifically ask about resistance or the things that Megan's discussed, we'll take that quickly. Give you a minute, but it looks like we've covered most of our questions here, Megan. That does conclude the basis of our webinar today. And we hope that you have some valuable information that you can take back. Again, if you have other questions or follow-up questions to this, make sure that our information is available to you. You can always learn more about what we're doing or chat with us or any of our extension educators throughout the state and ask questions. Our information is all online. Every county has their own website. We also have our Equine Studies at the University of Maryland website and Facebook page. We'd be happy to have you follow us there for information about our upcoming webinars. We do have several scheduled, again, every Tuesday at 3 p.m. throughout the month of June now coming up. We hope that you'll continue to join us. And as I'd mentioned, we will be posting these to our YouTube channel, University of Maryland Horse Extension. So please check back. You can check those out, share them with folks who may not have been able to be on with us live, and watch them at your leisure. So we thank you all so much for joining us today. Hope that you got some great information, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar.